She lived with this stove for 20 years. The bulge on the wall seemed insignificant until one day she broke the clay and saw what her husband had hidden during his lifetime, and the truth that he had hidden from everyone. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The house had settled into the kind of silence that only comes with time, when the walls have absorbed so many years of voices that they no longer bother to echo anything back. She had grown accustomed to that silence. It accompanied her from morning until night, filling the gaps that once belonged to her husband's presence, his laughter, his footsteps, and even his frustrated muttering when something in the house resisted repair. The home he had built and shaped with his own hands seemed to hold his memory in every nail and beam, and yet nothing carried it more strongly than the large clay stove in the center of the main room. It had been his pride and obsession, something he treated almost like a living creature. She had never thought much about it beyond appreciating its warmth during the harsh seasons, but since his passing, she had begun to notice every small imperfection as if they were messages he had left behind. Lately, she had felt a pressure inside her chest that she could not quite name. Not sadness exactly, not fear either, but something unsettled, something that waited beneath her awareness. It clung to her in the quiet hours of the morning when she swept the kitchen, and lingered again at dusk when she sat by the stove with her hands resting idly on her knees. She told herself it was simply age, or loneliness, or the constant reminders of what had been lost. Yet the feeling remained, as though the house itself was trying to draw her attention to something she had not yet seen. The stove had begun to misbehave as winter approached. It still gave heat, but not with the steady, reliable breath it once had. Ash collected faster than before. The smoke sometimes curled in strange patterns, and the draft felt weaker even on calm days. She decided she would clean it thoroughly, believing the fault must lie somewhere inside, hidden from view. It was work she had done before, though never with the same care her husband had given it. He used to kneel beside the stove with an intent expression, tapping the clay, brushing the soot, adjusting the iron grate the way a musician might tune an instrument. She had watched him many evenings, his brow furrowed in concentration as he studied the stove as if it held secrets only he could understand. She gathered the tools she needed, the long iron poker, the small wooden brush, the metal pan for scooping out ash. She opened the stove's lower door, feeling a gust of stale heat drifting out, then reached inside to pull out the first clumps of soot and coal. Her hands worked methodically, guided by years of routine, until a faint irregularity caught her eye. At first, she thought it was only a trick of the dark interior, a shadow thrown by the embers, but when she leaned closer, she saw it clearly. A small bulge on the right inner wall of the stove. The clay protruded just slightly, barely noticeable, yet unmistakably different from the rest of the surface. It had a smoother texture, almost too smooth, and its color was faintly lighter than the baked clay around it. She sat back for a moment, puzzled. The stove was so familiar to her that any change stood out sharply. She brushed her fingertips against the bulge, and the clay felt cooler and softer than it should have been. A memory surfaced, distant, yet suddenly sharp. Years ago, long before his illness, her husband had spent an entire afternoon working inside the stove. When she asked him what he was doing, he answered vaguely that a crack had appeared, and he needed to patch it. Later, she recalled noticing a faint clay stain on his shirt, the color slightly different from the original mixture he had used when building the stove. She had not questioned it. There were many small repairs he handled without explanation, and she had trusted him completely. But now, staring at the protrusion, she felt something stir uneasily within her. She reached out and pressed lightly on the bulge. It yielded more than clay should. She withdrew her hand quickly, her pulse quickening. If the clay was soft after so many years, then it had not been fully hardened. It had been placed there intentionally, perhaps hurriedly. She leaned forward again, examining the outer side of the stove's right wall. There, too, she found a faint irregularity, though less pronounced, as if someone had smoothed it over carelessly. It was then that the quiet, persistent pressure she had felt these past months finally resolved itself into a single unmistakable emotion: fear. She did not want to acknowledge it, yet she could not ignore what her eyes revealed. The stove, the object that had warmed her through countless winters, now looked like something else entirely, a keeper of secrets she had never suspected existed. The thought felt absurd, almost disloyal, as though she were accusing her husband of wrongdoing simply because of a strange patch of clay. Yet as she studied the bulge once more, she felt a tightening in her throat, a warning whisper from her intuition that the truth, however long buried, was close to surfacing. She hesitated before touching the poker. The metal was cold in her hand, its weight grounding her, pushing her past the trembling uncertainty. She inserted the poker into the narrow space beside the protrusion, testing the thickness of the clay. It cracked far too easily, pieces crumbling down like dried mud rather than the dense, solid material the rest of the stove was made from. She scraped gently, the sound sharp in the quiet room, and more clay flaked away. Her heart pounded as she realized just how thin the outer layer was. Whoever had done this had intended the covering to be convincing, but not durable. When the opening grew wide enough, she set aside the poker and used her fingers to pull away the remaining shards. Beneath the thin shell, she uncovered a hollow space carved neatly into the wall, hidden between the layers of the stove. It was not large, just big enough for a small object to fit inside, but the presence of any cavity at all sent a chill through her. The air inside was warm from the stove's last use, but dry, untouched by smoke. Something rested inside the pocket, wrapped in darkness. She reached cautiously into the hollow and felt coarse fabric beneath her fingertips. She lifted it out slowly, breath catching as the shape took form. It was a small bag, or rather a pouch, made from thick, rough canvas, blackened in places but not burned. That alone startled her. Anything left too close to a stove's firebox should have been damaged beyond recognition. Yet this pouch seemed protected, nestled deep enough inside the wall to escape the heat. The drawstring, made of old twine, was frayed but intact. She placed the pouch on her lap as she sat back on the floor. Her hands trembled as she untied the string, part of her wanting desperately to stop, to close the pouch again and return it to its hiding place. But another part, a deeper, more insistent part, knew that opening it was unavoidable. She pulled the pouch wide, and its contents glinted faintly in the dim light. The first thing she noticed was metal. Several small shapes nestled together, their surfaces dulled by ash, but undeniably ornate. She lifted out the first piece, a ring with an intricate design and a delicate engraving on the inner band. It was too fine, too elegant to be anything her husband would have possessed. She examined a brooch next, its once bright surface obscured by soot, yet still clearly valuable. She found a chain, a pendant with a stone she did not recognize, a medallion that opened to reveal an aged photograph of a woman and a child. None of these items belonged to her or to anyone in her family. They had never been in the house before. Not in drawers, not in keepsake boxes, not in any memory she could recover. She felt the world narrow around her as realization settled in. These were not random trinkets. They were keepsakes, heirlooms maybe, items that someone somewhere must have mourned. She reached back into the pouch and withdrew 2 folded papers, brittle with age. One she recognized immediately. The handwriting, uneven and jagged, was unmistakably her husband's. The other letter was written in a different hand, delicate and looping, perhaps a woman's. She did not unfold them yet. The weight of the discovery pressed too heavily on her all at once. Instead, she drew out the remaining items. A small square of cloth embroidered with a crest she had never seen before, and a metal plate bearing a carved address. A final object remained, a key, tiny and old-fashioned, the kind used for locking small personal boxes or secret drawers. She stared at the collection spread before her. Her breath came in shallow waves. Every piece she touched intensified the sense that her husband had lived a life she had never known, that he had carried burdens he had never shared. She felt sorrow, betrayal, confusion, fear, all layered together until the emotions blurred. It was as though the room had shifted around her, the familiar turning unfamiliar in the span of a single discovery. Memories swarmed, each now cast in a different light. His insistence on repairing the stove alone, his occasional restlessness, the nights when he paced by the window without explanation, the letters he burned without letting her see their contents, the moments when he returned home looking troubled, dirty, or shaken, brushing off her concern with vague remarks. She had believed him, as any devoted wife would, and now she wondered what truths she had ignored. She folded her hands tightly around the pouch, as if anchoring herself to something solid amid the storm brewing inside her. She did not know what the letters contained, but she sensed they would answer questions she had not even known to ask. Yet she also sensed that once she read them, nothing in her life would return to its peaceful, untroubled stillness. The stove crackled softly behind her, settling as though releasing the last remnants of heat. She turned toward it slowly, seeing it now not as the heart of the home, but as a guardian of a secret her husband had concealed with deliberate care. It had watched over these hidden things through countless winters, keeping them safe from discovery until now. She wondered what had compelled him to choose this particular place, this stove he had built with his own hands, as the final hiding spot for whatever truth lay inside the pouch. She lifted the letters at last, holding them delicately, afraid they might crumble. The room felt colder than before, and yet warmth lingered around her from the stove, sealing her in a cocoon of memory and revelation. She placed the pouch beside her and closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself one last breath of the life she had known. The life before she saw the bulging clay, before she broke open the wall, before she uncovered the pouch that held the remnants of a hidden past. When she opened her eyes again, she understood something with absolute clarity. She could no longer turn away from whatever truth had been buried in the stove. For better or worse, the secrets her husband had tried to hide were now hers to face, and there was no path back to the ignorance she once lived in. The first step into that past lay in the folded papers she now held between her fingers. She stood slowly, gathering the pouch and its contents, feeling the full weight of their significance. As she placed them carefully on the table, she knew her life had changed. Whatever she uncovered next would shift everything she believed about the man she had loved and about herself. And though she felt fear rising within her, she also felt a strange, inevitable resolve. The truth had been waiting for her, sealed behind a thin layer of clay, and she understood now that it would not rest until she faced it. The letters lay on the table untouched for several long minutes as she stood above them, gathering the courage to unfold what her husband had once folded so tightly. Outside the windows, the autumn light dimmed slowly, turning the edges of the room into soft shadows, as though the house itself wished to retreat from the truth she was about to confront. The stove behind her radiated the last faint warmth of its earlier fire, but she felt none of it. Her hands hovered over the brittle papers, aware that the moment she opened them, the life she thought she understood might split apart in ways she could not predict. Yet she also knew she could not delay. She had lived long enough to recognize that some discoveries, once made, demand to be faced. She picked up the first letter, the one written in the familiar uneven hand she had seen on countless grocery lists and birthday notes. Even before she unfolded it, she felt something inside her tighten. The paper was fragile, flecked with soot and time, and the creases resisted opening as though they had grown accustomed to their sealed existence. When at last she spread the page flat, her husband's handwriting appeared, slanted, tense, marked by irregular pressure. He had written this with urgency, perhaps even fear. She traced the lines with her eyes, reading words that seemed to echo from a distant version of him, a version she had never known. The letter spoke of a decision he regretted, a decision made in youth or desperation or both. He mentioned a job he had taken many years ago, working among men he later wished he had never met. The letter described a night when things went wrong, when something valuable had disappeared, leaving everyone involved trapped in a web of suspicion and danger. He wrote about a man who had confronted him, a man who vanished soon afterward. He confessed to hiding objects he claimed he had never intended to keep, saying he feared both the consequences of returning them and the danger of holding on to them. The tone of the letter was tormented, heavy with remorse, as though he had carried the weight of those events through every day of their shared life. As she read, she found herself hearing his voice, not the warm tones of the man who had sat at this very table drinking morning coffee, but a voice tinged with desperation. He wrote about wanting to tell her the truth countless times, but failing, about having planned to reveal everything once he retired or once they moved away from the area, yet never finding the courage. He wrote that the objects hidden in the stove were reminders of a past he could not outrun, a past he had hoped would stay buried until after he was gone. The final lines of the letter trembled across the page with sorrow. If she were reading it, then he was no longer there to bear the burden himself. She set the letter down slowly, feeling the ache behind her ribs deepen. The weight she sensed these past months now had shape, as though the unspoken fears that lingered during his final days were finally speaking to her. She reached for the second letter, hesitating before unfolding it. This one was different from the moment she touched it. The handwriting was elegant, meticulous, written with patience rather than haste. She imagined a woman seated at a polished desk, writing with steady determination, trying to pierce the silence around a tragedy. The letter began with a plea. The writer begged for the return of certain family possessions, heirlooms passed down through generations and entrusted to her care. She explained that these pieces were all that remained after a devastating loss. Her words painted a picture of a family torn apart, of a young woman whose future was stolen, of a house that once brimmed with life, but now felt hollow. She described waiting for something, anything, that might restore a part of what had vanished. Her desperation seeped through the ink, making the page feel heavier than its weight. She wrote with the hope that whoever possessed the items, whoever held the pendant, the brooch, the ring, would understand their meaning and return them. She expressed grief not only over their disappearance, but over the silence that followed, a silence she could not bear. The letter did not accuse anyone directly. Instead, it carried the gentle heartbreak of someone who believed in humanity, despite all evidence to the contrary. As she read, she felt the contrast between the writer's sorrow and her husband's fear, and she sensed more clearly than ever the shape of the crime that had bridged their worlds. She imagined the life of the woman who wrote the letter, the burden she carried, the unanswered questions, the hope that perhaps one day justice or closure might come. That hope had been sealed in her stove, hidden away and left unanswered for decades. She placed both letters side by side on the table. Between them, She saw the outline of a story that had unfolded long before she met her husband. She understood that the man she had loved had not been the villain of that story, but neither had he been innocent. He had been trapped between guilt and fear, making choices that weighed heavily upon him. He had carried the secret in his body language, in the restless nights when he had lain awake staring at the ceiling, in the moments when he had withdrawn into himself without explanation. She remembered him pausing mid-task, as though listening for something only he could hear. She recalled how he would sometimes startle at the sound of footsteps outside, or how he would check the locks twice before bed. She had assumed it was caution or habit, never imagining it was tied to events that had shaped his life long before she entered it. She gathered the jewelry next, lifting each piece with growing unease. The ring with the engraving felt too personal to have been casually taken. The brooch, though worn with time, radiated the elegance of something cherished. The pendant's gem, even dulled by age, hinted at considerable value. The medallion opened easily, revealing the faded photograph of a woman and child. Two faces she had never seen, faces that did not belong to her family or to any story her husband had shared. The woman's expression was serene, yet her eyes held a depth of emotion that stirred something indescribable inside her. The child, standing close beside her, wore a small smile, captured in a moment that must have meant everything to the person who once carried the medallion. She laid the photograph on the table and stared at it for a long time. Who were they? Why had her husband kept their image hidden with the jewelry? Were they related to the tragedy the second letter described? Did her husband know them personally? Or had the medallion simply been part of what was stolen? These questions pulled her deeper into a story she had yet to fully understand. She retrieved the small square of cloth next. The embroidered crest suggested lineage, perhaps a wealthy family whose possessions these were. The fabric was sturdy but aged, carrying the faint scent of dust and time. She folded it carefully, though her hands were shaking, and placed it beside the letters. Finally, she lifted the thin metal plate engraved with the address. The numbers and letters were nearly worn away, but still readable. It was not an address she recognized, not in their town or the surrounding area. It must have been somewhere he lived before, somewhere tied to the events described in the letters. She understood then that her next step would be to follow the trail he had left. She rose from the table, pacing slowly around the room as she tried to absorb everything. The walls felt narrower, the air heavier. The stove, once a comforting presence, now felt like a silent witness to the past. Her husband had built it with such care and devotion, yet beneath that craftsmanship had hidden a secret capable of undoing the trust she had placed in him. She did not want to condemn him. She remembered his kindness, his patience, his devotion to her, but she could not deny the evidence lying on the table, nor the weight of the guilt he carried. She sat down again, placing her hands flat against the table, letting her fingers absorb the faint grain of the wood. The decision she faced was not simple. She could tuck everything back into the pouch, hide it once more, and pretend she had seen nothing. She could let the past remain where it had been buried, sealed behind a wall of clay and time. Yet she knew that if she did, she would never find peace. The uneasiness that had followed her these past months was the echo of a secret, pressing against the surface of her life, demanding to be seen. Now that she had glimpsed its edges, she could not look away. Her eyes drifted toward the window, where the last traces of daylight had faded into dusk. Tomorrow, she told herself, she would go to the address on the metal plate. She would see what stood there, if anything remained. She would try to piece together the story her husband had spent his life avoiding. She owed that to him, to the woman who wrote the letter, and to herself. She had lived her life with honesty and care. She would not abandon that now, even if the truth proved painful. She gathered the letters and the items carefully, placing them back in the pouch for safekeeping. The drawstring pulled tight with a soft whisper, sealing the collection once more, but the secret itself no longer felt contained. It had seeped into the room, into her understanding of the man she had loved, into the path she now felt compelled to follow. When she rose to extinguish the lamp, she paused by the stove, touching its surface lightly. The clay felt cool under her fingers, rough and cracked in places. She felt no anger toward it. The stove had only done what it was built to do: contain heat, shelter memories, hold what had been placed within it. It had not chosen to be the keeper of a secret. Her husband had chosen that. As she made her way to bed, she felt the familiar ache of loneliness approach her like a shadow. Yet beneath it lay a new feeling, sharper and more urgent. It was the awareness that she stood at the threshold of something larger than her grief, something connected to people she had never met, events she had never imagined, and truths she had never been meant to uncover. When she closed her eyes that night, sleep did not come quickly. Instead, she drifted in and out of restless thoughts, her mind replaying scenes from years ago, searching for hints she might have missed. She saw her husband working quietly in the evening light, shaping clay, humming under his breath. She saw the way he sometimes paused for no reason she could discern, staring at the door as though expecting someone. She saw the fear behind his eyes on the rare occasions when he thought she wasn't looking. These recollections, once insignificant, now formed a language she could finally understand. Before dawn, she awoke to a cold that seeped through her bones. She lay still for a moment, listening to the steady silence around her. The day ahead would be difficult, but the decision was already made. She would go to the address. She would face whatever waited for her there. The truth had been sealed inside her stove for decades, and now it was her turn to break through the surface of the past. She rose from bed with slow, deliberate movements, preparing herself for the journey. The pouch sat on the table where she had left it the night before, and she picked it up with a sense of purpose. The weight of it felt heavier than it had when she first discovered it, as though the objects inside had gathered meaning overnight. Stepping out of the house into the pale light of morning, she understood that her life had shifted irrevocably. The man she had loved had been shaped by choices she could not undo, and now she was stepping into the spaces he once feared to enter. She closed the door behind her, hearing the soft click of the latch, and knew she was walking toward a truth that would change everything. The road out of her small town felt longer than she remembered, as though the landscape itself stretched to mirror the distance she was crossing between the life she had lived and the one she was about to confront. The morning air was cold and dry, carrying the faint scent of earth and fallen leaves. She walked with the pouch tucked securely inside her coat, feeling its weight press gently against her side with each step, reminding her that she was no longer moving through familiar territory. She had woken before the sun, unable to lie still any longer, driven by a quiet determination that felt strange in its intensity. The address engraved on the metal plate had guided her course for the day, pointing her toward a place tied not to her memories, but to her husband's hidden past. The town she entered was older, more worn than hers, a place where buildings sagged under the burden of decades, their paint chipped, their windows cloudy from neglect. Streets curved in long, slow arcs, flanked by houses that bore little resemblance to the polished homes that had appeared in the outskirts over the years. She felt as though she had stepped backward into a time that refused to move on. The address led her deeper into the oldest district, where the sidewalks cracked beneath her feet, and the silence grew heavier, broken only by the occasional creak of an unseen shutter. A few distant shapes moved across the windows of the houses she passed, people beginning their day, unaware of the reason she had come there. When she finally arrived at the plot corresponding to the address on the plate, she found not a house, but an empty stretch of ground, overgrown with tangled weeds. It was bordered by a leaning fence coated in rust, its slats warped and softened by years of weather. A line of trees cast long shadows across the lot, and in the far corner stood the crumbling remains of a foundation, half buried beneath dirt and debris. The air around the place felt strangely still, as though even the wind hesitated to disturb it. She stepped cautiously toward the remains of what had once been a house, feeling an inexplicable pressure behind her ribs. The ground was uneven, littered with broken bricks, fragments of tile, and scraps of wood that had rotted to a dark, soft mass. Here and there she glimpsed remnants of past lives, a chipped piece of porcelain, the twisted hinge of a door, a fragment of stone that might have been part of a fireplace. The lot had the air of abandonment that comes only when a place has been left to time without protest. The house that once stood there must have been torn down many years ago, perhaps after a fire or structural collapse, or perhaps because the memories it held had grown too heavy for anyone to bear. She imagined her husband standing in this very place decades earlier, young and unsure, caught in a world that demanded more from him than he had been able to give. She wandered slowly across the lot, stepping carefully to avoid tripping over the broken remains hidden beneath the weeds. She tried to envision the house as it once stood, where the walls had risen, where windows had looked out onto the street, where the rooms had been arranged. Perhaps this had been the home of the woman who wrote the letter, or perhaps it belonged to someone else connected to the events her husband had described. She reached the old foundation and crouched down to examine it. The concrete was cracked and chipped, its edges softened by wind and rain. The remains of a rusted pipe jutted from the ground nearby, and beside it lay fragments of charred wood as though there had once been a fire. A movement caught her eye, a shape not of debris, but of deliberate construction. Buried beneath a plank, half concealed by earth, was a small metal box. She hesitated, wondering if it had been left by someone long before, or if it had simply endured unnoticed through the years. With effort, she pulled the plank aside, revealing the box fully. It was rusted on the edges, its surface pitted from exposure, but the lid was intact. She reached for it cautiously, her breath catching as she lifted it. The box was not heavy, but it carried a significance she could feel in her hands. She wiped dirt from its surface, noticing faint scratches that might once have been decorative etchings. She opened the lid with gentle pressure, and inside she found a stack of old newspaper clippings, yellowed with age and stiff with damp. They lay folded together, each one a preserved fragment of a story long forgotten. She lifted the top clipping and saw the headline, "Heiress disappears under strange circumstances." The article described a young woman who vanished from her family's home after a night of unrest. She was last seen by a neighbor during the early hours of the morning, and the disappearance had sparked frantic searches and speculation. The article mentioned that valuable heirlooms were also missing, raising suspicions of foul play or a planned escape. As she read, her gaze drifted to the photograph accompanying the text. The woman in the image had the same delicate features as the one in the medallion. The recognition struck her with the force of a blow. She set the article aside and examined the next clipping. This one reported on a group of workers who had been present at the estate shortly before the disappearance. Their names were listed, along with descriptions of their involvement in various renovation projects. She scanned the list, and her breath halted when she saw her husband's name printed among them. The clipping suggested that some of the workers had been questioned by the authorities, but released without charges due to lack of evidence. Yet the reporter hinted at lingering suspicions, implying that someone among them might know more than they admitted. The third clipping focused on a man whose photograph was printed beside it, his eyes narrowed and his expression stern. The caption described him as an associate of the family, someone who had been seen arguing with another worker in the days leading up to the disappearance. This man, the article said, vanished shortly after the arrest did. Some believed he had run away. Others thought he might have been involved in the crime. No trace of him was ever found. She looked at the image for a long time, trying to gauge whether her husband had known him closely, whether this man was the someone in her husband's letter, the one who had vanished after their confrontation. She remained crouched beside the box for several minutes, reading and rereading the clippings, trying to absorb the gravity of what they revealed. The story was not a simple theft or misunderstanding. It was tangled in tragedy, suspicion, and unspoken truths. The woman who wrote the letter had lost more than heirlooms. She had lost hope, dignity, perhaps even family, and her husband had been a silent witness to all of it. She wondered what he had felt when he saw these articles decades ago. Fear, guilt, sorrow? Had he clipped them himself, or had someone else gathered them? Had he revisited them over the years, reliving the events in his mind? She imagined him sitting alone, holding these clippings, wrestling with the consequences of actions he could never undo. As she placed the clippings back into the box, she sensed a shift in the air around her, as though the silence had thickened. She rose slowly, clutching the box to her chest, and turned toward the street. At first, she saw nothing unusual. The houses across from the lot were quiet, their curtains drawn. A single stray cat walked along the sidewalk, pausing to stare at her before disappearing behind a fence. The street lamps, though unlit in daylight, stood in a solemn row. Then she noticed the figure. At the far end of the block, near the side of a building, someone stood very still. She could not see the face clearly, but the posture was unmistakable, upright, alert, and fixed on her. The person remained motionless for what felt like a long moment. She blinked, and in that instant, the figure stepped out of view, slipping behind the corner of a building. The sudden disappearance sent a cold tremor through her. She wondered if the person had been watching her for some time, or if they had simply noticed her presence by chance. Either possibility frightened her. The secrets she had unearthed were not the kind to lie quiet. Someone else, she sensed, was still invested in keeping them hidden. She clutched the metal box tighter, trying to calm the unease building in her chest. Her thoughts raced. Had the watcher followed her from home, or had they been drawn to the lot for their own reasons? Was this an old resident, someone connected to the family, or someone tied to her husband's past? She told herself not to jump to conclusions, yet her instincts urged her to take the sighting seriously. The figure had not approached her. That, in some ways, was more unsettling than if they had. It suggested the watcher was assessing her, waiting, perhaps deciding. She turned away from the street and began walking back toward the train station. Each step felt heavier than the last, burdened by the knowledge now pressed upon her. She kept glancing over her shoulder, expecting to see the figure again, but the street remained empty, its quiet unbroken. She felt a strange mix of relief and dread, unsure which emotion meant she was safer. The journey back home passed in a blur. When she stepped through her front door and set the metal box on the table beside the pouch, she felt both exhausted and restless. The stove loomed quietly in the corner, its clay walls dulled by shadow. The house seemed smaller now, filled with the gravity of the past she had uncovered. She sank slowly into a chair, letting her hands fall into her lap. The image of the watcher lingered in her mind, joining the clippings, the letters, the jewelry, and her husband's face in a growing constellation of unanswered questions. She knew she was no longer simply uncovering secrets. She was walking into a story that others might not want retold. And though she feared what lay ahead, she understood that she could not turn back now. The truth had begun to unfold, and the next steps would draw her deeper still, into the heart of what her husband had spent his life running from. When she woke the next morning, the air in the house felt heavier than before, as though the weight of the past she had unearthed had settled into the walls overnight. She lay still for a few moments, listening to the quiet, trying to calm the unease coursing through her. The memory of the figure watching her in the abandoned lot the previous day returned with a sharpness that made her pulse quicken. It wasn't a memory she could dismiss. It felt like a presence that might return at any moment, waiting just beyond the edge of her vision. She rose slowly, dressing with deliberate movements, as though each motion helped her gather the strength she needed. The stove in the corner, cold now, seemed somehow more solemn than before, as if it too understood that its long-kept secret was no longer its own. She walked past it with a sense of finality, the realization pressing upon her that she could never again look at it simply as an object of warmth or comfort. It had become the threshold she crossed into a past her husband had never intended her to see. On the kitchen table lay the pouch and the metal box, placed side by side like two guardians of intertwined truths. She approached them slowly, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest, mark the beginning of another day in which the boundaries of her life would shift. She opened the pouch again, emptying its contents carefully onto the table. The jewelry, the letters, the cloth with the crest, the small key, and the metal plate with the address she had visited. Each item now seemed to pulse with significance, more vivid and alarming than when she first discovered them. They were no longer relics hidden in clay. They were evidence pieces of a story stretching far beyond her home. She reached for the small key, turning it between her fingers. It was old, its edges worn by time, its shape distinctive. It seemed too purposeful, too meaningful to be an ordinary key. Yet she could not recall anything in her house that required a key like this. The memory of her husband working in the shed behind their house surfaced unexpectedly. How he would sometimes spend long hours there, moving between tasks she never fully understood. There had been a cabinet in that shed, one he kept locked, though she had never thought much of it. He had always been a man who valued his tools and private projects, and she had respected that. But now, with the key cool against her skin, she sensed that the cabinet might hold more than she had ever imagined. She carried the key with her as she stepped out behind the house. The shed stood slightly weathered, its roof bowed in places from years of storms, but it remained a sturdy structure. The morning light slanted across it, illuminating dust particles suspended in the air like tiny drifting seeds. She entered slowly, her eyes adjusting to the dimness. The smell of old wood and oil greeted her, mingled with the faint scent of earth that seeped through the cracks between the boards. She moved toward the old cabinet, a tall, narrow piece with a lock near the top. Her heart beat steadily, loudly, as she slipped the key into the lock. It turned more easily than she expected, as though it had been waiting for this moment. The mechanism clicked, and she opened the cabinet door with careful hands. Inside, she found not tools or spare nails, but a wooden box she had never seen before. It was plain, unmarked, yet its careful construction suggested it had been built with intention. She lifted it from the cabinet and carried it outside, preferring the clarity of daylight to the shadows within the shed. The box was surprisingly heavy for its size, and as she set it on the ground, she wondered how many times her husband had handled it, while she remained oblivious. When she opened the lid, the first things she saw were notebooks, her husband's handwriting filling page after page. The sight of his words, preserved through time and distance, hit her with a force she had not anticipated. She picked up the top notebook and opened it to the first page. The writing began calmly, describing his early years working on the estate, tied to the disappearance described in the newspaper clippings. But as she continued to read, the tone shifted. His entries became strained, full of conflicted emotions. He wrote about decisions he had made under pressure, choices he regretted but could not undo. He spoke of men he worked with, including one who had tried to involve him in a scheme he wanted no part of. There were mentions of threats, of whispered accusations, of fear that clung to him long after the events had ended. He wrote about the night the heiress vanished, describing the chaos that followed, the search parties, the whispered conversations among the workers, the way suspicion seemed to cling to everyone. He recounted how one of the men had argued with another just before disappearing, and how he feared that violence had been involved. His entries described being torn between telling the truth and remaining silent, between seeking justice and protecting himself from retaliation. He wrote about the day he found the jewelry hidden behind some loose boards in a storage room, and how he feared returning it in case it implicated him further. He wrote of wanting to return the items anonymously, but every attempt was met with obstacles that left him paralyzed. As she turned page after page, she felt as though she were reading the inner life of a stranger. The man who had lived beside her for so many years had carried a burden she could never have imagined, a burden he had chosen to bear, alone, to protect her from the shadows of his past. He had feared that if she knew the truth, she would see him differently. Perhaps he had feared she would leave, or that she would be dragged into the dangerous web he had barely escaped. The notebooks were filled with fear, remorse, hope, and ultimately resignation. He had lived in the shadow of his past and had accepted that some truths must remain buried. She closed the notebook with trembling hands, unable to read any further for the moment. She leaned back, letting the cool air fill her lungs. The yard around her seemed suddenly quiet, almost reverent, as though the world recognized the significance of what she had uncovered. She stared at the wooden box, feeling an overwhelming mix of grief and understanding. For the first time since finding the pouch in the stove, she felt close to her husband. Not the man she had thought she knew, but the man he truly was. She began to explore the rest of the box's contents. Beneath the notebooks lay newspaper clippings, similar to those she had found in the abandoned lot. They were meticulously preserved, as though her husband had returned to them again and again. There were also small items that might have once belonged to the missing worker mentioned in the articles: a pocket knife, a badge from a uniform, a scrap of torn fabric. She wondered if her husband had collected these items as reminders of what had happened, or as warnings to himself of what he had escaped. At the bottom of the box, she found a letter addressed to her, sealed but unmailed. The envelope was yellowed and soft, its edges frayed. She opened it with care, her hands trembling as she unfolded the paper. Her husband had written it years before his death, perhaps intending to give it to her only when he felt she could understand. He wrote about his love for her, his gratitude for the peace she had brought into his life, and his regret at keeping secrets from her. He explained that he had intended to confess everything, but as time passed, the weight of his guilt grew heavier, and he feared the consequences more. He wrote that the jewelry in the stove had been meant for safe return, that he had never intended to keep it, and that he had hoped one day to find a way to send it back without implicating anyone. Tears welled in her eyes as she read. She felt a deep ache within her, a sadness that her husband had suffered alone, mingled with sorrow for the family that had lost so much. She wondered how different their lives might have been if he had trusted her with the truth, but she knew that regret would serve no purpose now. What mattered was what she chose to do next. She sat with the letter for a long time, absorbing every word. When she finally folded it carefully and placed it back in the box, she felt a shift inside her. The fear that had haunted her since she first discovered the pouch began to transform into something else. Not clarity, not certainty, but resolve. She understood that the items in the pouch were not simply relics of a crime. They were symbols of unfinished stories, of people who had lived through tragedy and deserved closure. And now she held the power to offer that closure. But the decision was not simple. If she returned the jewelry, she risked reopening wounds for a family that might have moved on. If she involved the authorities, she could tarnish her husband's memory. And if she chose to hide everything once more, she would betray the trust implied by the letters and notebooks. She sat in the yard, the weight of these choices pressing down on her, feeling the world fall silent around her, as though holding its breath. She stood slowly, gathering the contents of the box and the pouch, and carried them back into the house. She placed everything gently on the table, arranging the jewelry and letters in front of her. The stove loomed behind her, a reminder of the secrets it had kept and the truth it had preserved. She turned toward it, feeling its presence like a living entity. She approached it slowly, running her hand across its cool clay surface, remembering the warmth it once provided, the comfort it had offered during long winters, the life it had helped sustain. She knew she could never return the items to its hollow walls. That chapter had closed. She returned to the table and began to think. Hours passed as she weighed each possible choice, imagining the consequences of each. She imagined the family receiving the jewelry, perhaps recognizing the pieces instantly, perhaps grieving anew. She imagined the authorities opening an old case file, searching for explanations in events that occurred decades ago. She imagined burying everything somewhere the world would never find it, but the thought filled her with shame, as though she were succumbing to the same fear that had consumed her husband. In the late afternoon, when the sun cast long shadows across the room, she made her decision. She gathered the jewelry and placed it in a plain envelope, along with the letter written by the woman whose pain had been laid bare on the page. She added a note of her own, unsigned, explaining that these items had been safely kept and that they belonged to the family of the woman who had vanished. She did not include her name or any details that might link the return to her husband. She wanted the family to have the closure they deserved without rekindling accusations or suspicions. This was not about justice in a legal sense. It was about restoring something that had been lost. She sealed the envelope and prepared it for mailing. As she walked to the post office, she felt the weight of the years lifting slightly from her shoulders. The decision had not been easy, but it felt right. She placed the envelope in the outgoing mail slot, hearing it slide into the bin below. A quiet finality settled over her. She stood still for a long moment, breathing slowly, absorbing the significance of what she had done. When she returned home, she entered the house with a mixture of exhaustion and peace. She looked once more at the stove, no longer a keeper of secrets, but a symbol of truth revealed. She felt closer to her husband now, not because she understood every choice he had made, but because she understood the fear and humanity that had shaped him. She approached the stove, placing her hand upon it, and whispered a silent farewell. Not to him, but to the burden he had carried. The truth had finally been set free, and with it, she hoped, both of them could rest. In the quiet that followed, she sat down at the table, watching the light fade outside. She knew the story was not altogether over. There might still be consequences, questions, or memories that resurfaced. But she also knew she had done what she could, and that was enough. For the first time in months, she felt the house breathe with her, its silence no longer heavy with secrets, but calm, open, and at peace. Subscribe for more stories, watch the next videos, and share this one with someone who needs to hear it.